Oh, hello there. This is Parley, the series where people like you support the stuff I do by asking me, well, it's normally really random questions. But behold, this incredibly unrandom question. Balance in PvE. One of the least random questions one could ask me. Well, let's get right into it. This parlay is going to be about balancing games when it's not, players fighting each other with similar options, not balancing different options players can use to kill each other, balancing different player options that are not used against other player options, balancing for player versus environment stuff. And when I said that, you may have had some thoughts. But the point of this parlay is to try to get at a greater understanding of this topic. I, on my streams and in other similar parlays, have several times said, some things I think about this, and some people in the world, such as the developers who we're going to be quoting in this video, have said some other things about this, and both of those things are not working to help people understand what is going on. I think that I am right and they are not. It's true. But clearly, the way I'm saying it isn't working any better than what they're saying to get people to understand. So, for this parlay, I would like to invite you to try to keep an open mind, as will I, and we're going to try to learn something. We're going to try to figure out why this is a discussion. It should be quite easy to say yes or no. It does or doesn't matter. Why does it matter? What are the arguments for it? But a lot of the time, when I've heard people discuss this, well, it just isn't. And I don't think that's just the product of talking online. I think, yes, I have some kind of answer eventually. I think that there is an underlying cause that makes these discussions kind of futile in a way. And I'm going to describe that today. So first, I'm going to read this long, really well-written, really useful intro, including an example from YatogamiOdin, and that's going to frame the discussion. And this was really, really helpful. I find this to be an incredibly well-written question. You put a lot of effort into writing this, and I care about that effort. Let's read it. Go grab a snack, a beverage perhaps. I will be grabbing one later, but let's get started. YatogamiOdin. I, YatogamiOdin, would like to request a parlay on the idea of game balance, as perceived by the devs and by the players. Semi-recent patch notes for the early access game Mass Builder put forward an interesting take on how they intended to keep different damage properties, what other games would call elements, in line with one another. Here's what the developers said. Now, this is a quote in a quote, so give me a break. But basically, they're responding to questions about, like, if one property is more effective in PvE, how will you fix this? It's always a problem if something's either too strong or too weak, with their special effects like burn or whatever being meta once again. And the developers say, we'd like to answer that with, let them be too strong. As Mass Builder development has been going on, we don't think balance is required in PvE. Players must be able to fulfill their fantasy and have fun with the game. To the abyss with balancing, fun comes first. Just a very quick aside right there. So I want you to keep that quote in mind. The idea that the reason, this is very good, they said you do not need to balance in PvE, and the reason is that fun comes first, that players need to be able to fulfill their fantasy and have fun with the game. And apparently, that's not what balancing is for. Fun comes before that. Balancing is this other thing, and then fun is over here. So keep that in mind. Again, maybe you agree with that, maybe you don't, but that's what they're trying to say. So please keep that in mind. That's the example. And before we continue, I would also like to remind you that this is now an example. We were very briefly talking about Mass Builder, but I have not played this game. It doesn't actually matter. This is an example, a very good example of a developer making a strong claim that developers of other kinds of games have made that we can then discuss. But remember, like, maybe somehow this game doesn't require these same things, which is irrelevant because it's just an example now. We're not any longer commenting on this specific game. Okay? Yatogami continues. I see the pursuit of balance as an arrow that guides game development. What an interesting sentence. That's cool. For the Mass Builder devs to say something like, to the abyss with balancing, strikes me as very odd, because that says to me that they do not want a guided direction in their development. To better illustrate what I mean by balance as guidance, I will break down some of the concepts invoked by the quote. Okay, so these are a few things that, because of the thing that the developers said, it seems like they acknowledge or somewhat understand. 1. The devs recognize that effects may be too strong or too weak relative to one another. 2. The devs recognize the existence of the meta. And 3. The devs acknowledge fantasy fulfillment as a player desire. And I'll again remind you that that doesn't mean they mean the same things by those terms that we do, but we'll get back to that. The first idea is what I think most people would think of when it comes to balance. It's not always the case that two game pieces will be directly comparable. Warframe, Genshin Impact, there's lots of examples. This makes the calibration of those game pieces something of a subjective judgment, one based on feeling, rather than only based on objective or game measurable data. Right, this is easy to give a very quick example of. You can easily calculate the time to kill for a weapon in, I don't know, like pretty much any game. You can just put some mods on a weapon in Warframe, for example, or Apex Legends is a PvP game without builds, which I think changes a lot. But it's a simple example. It's very easy to just test, okay, I unload this weapon and do damage as fast as possible to this target, and I hit every shot. Or maybe I do some modifier for accuracy. What is the DPS? Like, what's the weapon's time to kill? That's extremely easy to do, but it doesn't make weapons balanced. For example, a burst fire weapon will need to fire a whole other burst if a target survives with just a little bit of health. Now, these things matter in different ways in PvE and PvP games, and in different PvE and PvP games. But it's just important to note that because these elements are choices, meaningful choices, i.e. like they are actually a different gameplay experience in some way, that kind of means categorically the definition of them being meaningfully different is that they are not directly mathematically comparable a lot of the time. It doesn't always mean that in every game, but the point is that developing is about both objective and subjective discussions about what the thing's power level, again, not even like should be, but like what it even is. Like what even is the power level of these weapons? Simply asking people what the best weapon is in a lot of games doesn't yield the same answer, not only because people are stupid, but because there isn't an answer. There isn't really a single answer. Anyway, we'll come back to that later. That ties into the second idea. As players form communities and discuss their experiences with a game, trends tend to emerge about what pieces work best. This provides a source of feedback and therefore actionable data for the devs. Generally speaking, there are going to be many more player consumers than hired playtesters. It's indeed pretty much impossible for that not to be true. By my perception, it would be negligent of the devs to not keep abreast of community sentiments. How they react to those sentiments is an open question, though. Indeed, I think a lot of the texture of different game developers is how well they balance player feedback and how much they keep that vocal minority grain of salt in mind. On the subject of player sentiment, the primary appeal of games with deep customization. Ooh, this is a dangerous sentence. What are you going to say? The primary appeal of games with deep customization is for the player to assemble the game pieces in the way they see fit. I don't feel that that is the only clearly primary purpose of a game with deep customization, but we're going to come back to that. This increased level of control relative to other games encourages the player to envision what they want out of the game. The role of the developers is to provide the game pieces and a foundation for what players can expect out of the game. I wouldn't disagree with that comment. At long last, we get to the crux of the parlay. What are your thoughts on the idea of balance, and how do they compare to my ideas and those of the mass builder devs? So again, we did literally just finish reading only the question, but there's a lot of examples in there. We've already discussed that quite a bit. And I hope I've given you some background to, when we are balancing something, what is that? We've talked a little bit about how you can't literally just math it out nearly all of the time. And if you can, it might not be a game where it would matter what you choose. Another point that we've talked about a bit already is like, why? Why balance things? What is the purpose of balancing things? We're not done with those topics, but we floated them. And before I launch into those topics in depth and then try to address this question, I want to give you kind of a thesis for what I think is going on, just very roughly, and then I'll go into explaining it. So going back to the thing that the developers said before, the purpose of balancing is, What do you think? Fun. The reason developers balance a game is so it will be more fun. There aren't other reasons to make development decisions in games except to make players like pay more money or something. But we're assuming that we're talking about the developer, not the publisher. We're assuming that the developer didn't spend their whole life getting a game career so that they could make games that are not fun. The developer is trying to help you have fun, unless they are thoroughly corrupt, which I promise you most of them really are not. Most development is done with the goal to make the player have fun. Therefore, most balance has the goal of making the player have more fun. I don't think most balance in most games does make players have more fun, but the goal is obviously to make players have more fun. There aren't any other goals. So I will go into more work to kind of prove that to you in some way, but I feel it is plainly absurd to suggest that there is any other reason to balance than fun. And then again, there's kind of a very separate topic about monetizing the game or getting players to continue playing the game that I'm going to argue that can be well outside the discussion of like balancing game pieces in this fine-tuned way. I don't think that it's simple to just say, oh, it's because they want to hook the players into the game more, because while nerfing something might force the players to use something else and thus hook them into the game more, it also, makes players leave the game because they rage quit from the developers taking away their fun toy. So I think it's pretty plain to see that at the very least, it's not clear which of those effects is stronger. And besides keeping the player in the game so the game makes more money, the only other reason to balance would be fun. So I hope you can accept that that's a reasonable premise. Okay. And because the only goal of balancing is fun, there are really two possibilities in my mind. I don't think that these developers, I don't know them, so it seems kind of unfair. I don't think that they're just stupid. So they know that the goal of balancing is fun, if they mean the same thing by balancing that I do. So there may be two possibilities. They either don't mean the same thing by balancing that I do, or they do mean the same thing, but they are lying on purpose to manipulate player sentiment. Now, it sounds very evil when I word it that way. It isn't. I believe most games do this, really. And I'll describe what those two things are. But what I'm saying, my claim that I'm going to go on to make, is that the way to explain this type of comment is that the developer doesn't actually mean that balancing doesn't lead to more fun, if balance leads to anything. And I will be demonstrating in this video that it is a logical contradiction to suggest that balancing wouldn't lead to more fun. That is nonsense. It's poppycock. That does not make logical sense. But that doesn't mean that what they're saying doesn't make a certain kind of sense. They might just mean something else. I think that a lot of developers, a lot of players, a lot of people simply mean bad balancing when they say balancing. Many discussions I've had on my stream ended with the other person realizing that I was referring to good balancing when I said balancing. And they eventually say, now that you've explained what you meant by balancing, I guess I agree with you, and I really only don't like bad balancing. Balance that doesn't make the game more fun. In other words, not balance that fails because balance is a bad goal, but balance that fails because it's bad, because they mess up, because it's hard. So before we go any further, I really want you to keep that one point in mind. There's a lot going on. I understand if you're a bit lost. Remember, that was just a summary. I'm hoping your neurons will fire back to those things later. But the main thing I want you to keep in mind is that there is a difference between balancing a game to make more options provide a power fantasy, because that is the only reason you would balance a game, with PvE at least. There's a difference between that and balancing a game poorly. Balancing something with the intention, the goal of making it more fun, but simply failing to make it more fun. Not because of balancing, but because bad. Not because the balancing was bad, but because failing happens to humans. And that goes off the thesis that balancing is just hard. It's just hard. It's difficult. When you make a game that has components, like we discussed before, that the very point of the components is that they be like mathematically incomparable in some way, that they be meaningfully different, meaning you can't just compare them objectively. If the very goal of the game is to make components that cannot be directly compared, it's pretty easy to understand why balancing just is inherently going to be hard. Like, that's going to be challenging. Player sentiment aside, and it's not something that's going to be put aside. We have to talk about that too. Yes, so now we need to get into the topic at the end that I pushed back on a little bit. So Yatogami, you'd said, on the subject of player sentiment, the primary appeal of games with deep customization is for the player to assemble the game pieces in the way they see fit. That's only part of the story. You know, I agree with you that for me, that is the point. But a game with a lot of different options, there could be a lot of different reasons that could appeal to someone. For example, in Magic the Gathering, a lot of people find the many different options available interesting, not because they wish to choose from those options, but because they wish to solve those options. And that might sound very cold calculating, just inherently unfun, and that is unfair. If you think that, that's okay. I'm happy you have that bias. Maybe not you, Yatogami, but like the listener, whoever you are, hi. You can't respond, sorry. There's the comments, but you might not think that sounds fun, but that doesn't mean it like is objectively unfun. In fact, I would argue, as somebody who does also like that it is actually kind of the same at its core. When you like customizing and building something like, you might say just for fun, a lot of people say, or casually, you are merely changing the goal of the customization such that there are multiple viable options. And when people are trying to solve a format, they are merely changing the goal of the deep customization so that there aren't multiple viable options. So that, like, from their limited definition, they're purposefully limiting the scope so that there are not multiple viable options. And the only reason there is any point in them doing that is because there are multiple viable options until they limit the scope that way. For example, if you played a format in Magic the Gathering that didn't have multiple, truly obviously also viable strategies, most players just wouldn't play it, which doesn't give the player who wants to solve the format anything to solve. This has kind of happened before, actually. There was a period of time in Magic the Gathering's history, and I know this is a PvP game, but it's meant to illustrate my point about customization in games, which we'll bring to PvE later. There was a point in Magic the Gathering's history where there was a deck that was so strong that nearly all of the top decks at the top tournaments were this deck within, give or take a few cards. And it was Caw-Blade with Jace the Mind Sculptor and Stoneforge Mystic and Squadron Hawk and Swords. And if you play Magic, you probably know about this. And if you don't, you can easily look it up. If you just look up any of those cards, you'll probably think, yeah, I don't really see how anything else would be good if that card was legal in a format that only had a few sets in it. There'd be no point in playing anything else. And I assure you, there really wasn't, except things that countered that deck, which was extremely difficult to do. Yes. And the thing about that format was that a lot of pro players said, I personally, as someone who wanted to solve the format, I am having fun. The mirror match is fun, they said, but I don't want the game to be this way because it's not fun for anyone else. Like, there's only those people that are having fun. And if the format has many different viable decks, it's still fun for those people who want to solve the format. It's just also fun for everybody else. That is one of the reasons why it always makes sense to try to balance game pieces, because on the surface, it's just fun for more people. Now, this is something I'm going to come back to very late in the parlay, so you're going to have to remember this one for a while. We're going to put a pin in it. But the key there is that it matters what order things become unbalanced in, because player sentiment about something has to do with how it was before it changed. That's very important. We're going to come back to it later. But the idea that if originally everything was at a comparable power level, that's different than if things had been at non-comparable power levels and then changed to be at somehow objectifiably comparable levels. Having the power level of the options be comparable so that players can pick what they want is good for people who don't want to pick what they want, and players who do want to pick what they want. It's good for people who want to distill it to one option and players who don't want that. It is better for both people, but it won't feel like it's better for both people if it doesn't start that way. That's a problem. I'm going to get back to that later, but the idea that, if something has an objective level, it would be balanced at. If it starts there, that's one thing. The players never had it at a different level. But if it started too powerful and then it gets less powerful, the players can never forget that compared to how it was, this is less powerful. The players in the game cannot lose that notion. And that makes it seem like balance, even good balance, comes at the expense of some types of people's fun and not others. But that is not inherently true. That is a product of the fact that games change over time. I'm not certain there's a solution to that problem, but I do think that's the reality. And we're going to get more into that later, but I want you to keep in mind the idea that good balancing, therefore, has the goal of making it so people with more goals when they come to a game have those goals fulfilled. By the same token, there are people who simply won't care about these things. There are going to be people who, there are lots of options in a game and they just want them for maybe the cosmetic appeal, or they just want something else in that game that isn't the customization. In Warframe, for example, Warframe has a famously fluid gameplay loop and a particular type of horde shooter combat and certain very odd types of story elements and a certain ambiance and a certain type of social community. I would argue that if you want Warframe for those things and not at all for the customization, Warframe is in some ways objectifiably the wrong game for you to play. There are games that serve those needs and not other needs better for you. But there are many reasons that that might simply not matter. You might not know what that game is or have the time to find it or care. You might just love Warframe's aesthetic. You might be a person who develops or is related to someone who develops the game. You might have a family or friend person that you want to play with and they are playing Warframe for a reason that is kind of objectifiably, you couldn't just play some other game. And so what are you to do? So yeah, fine. Like that's okay. And that will always be true. Like there are no games that are only deep choice customization because they have to have some gameplay loop, and that gameplay loop may be desirable in and of itself. You could make a game that tried to like make people not play it unless they cared about the deep customization. You would do that by making a gameplay loop that was either as minimal as possible or just like not good, like that would be uninteresting unless you only cared about the deep customization. And I guess there are games like that. But they do have another appeal, and there are people who play those games that simply like whatever weird gameplay loop that game has, or the gameplay loop literally is the buildcraft, and so it inherently will be interesting, and you get the point. So I just want to quickly come back to that point that Yatogami made about the primary appeal of games with deep customization isn't only to assemble the pieces as the player sees fit. It's not even the only intended goal of most games with deep customization, as you put it. Intend some of the players to limit the game from time to time to various sets of options. All games like this also include general and specific options to allow the player to limit their scope the way that they might like. This helps with decision paralysis. It appeals to different kinds of players. It gives people an on-ramp to customizing their own strategy. It's cool. It's a good piece of development. Not all games do this, but so many, so close to all of them do that I hope you'll forgive that. Again, I just really want to highlight that there is this idea of us versus them, where people feel like you can't just make a game that is a power fantasy and have it also appeal to the people that want balance or something. But those are not different desires. Like having the game be balanced makes all of those people get what they want if the game is balanced well. The problem, again, that we'll get into later comes in where the game wasn't balanced and then it becomes balanced. And then the players seeing that transition have this experience like my power fantasy thing, like came at the cost of some other thing. If you'll excuse me, this has been a very wordy parlay. and I'm going to take a beverage. And the beverage is coffee. Ooh, I don't like this one. Interesting, but I don't know. And you know, something you should know about me is that I'm a black hole for caffeine. I have there's a genetic thing that this is the limited science I've read on it that we don't know much about that causes some people to not have the stimulation reaction when they drink caffeine. You may not know this if you do, like most people have that reaction, but caffeine also makes you a bit sleepy. There's some science around that. A lot of people get a little bit more tired before the caffeine perks them up. You might even know this if you don't drink coffee right when you wake up. Right when you wake up, a lot of people are just really tired, and so you wouldn't notice if the caffeine made you a little more sleepy as you were waking up a little bit more. But I'll tell you, if you don't have the stimulation reaction, it does feel pretty different. Like, I just don't get that part of it. That's not a thing that appeals to me. Are you beginning to see how this relates to the parlay question? Oh, yes. Again, caffeine doesn't have that stimulating property for me, but there are many reasons you would want to drink coffee. You might like how it tastes in quite a few different ways. You might like it more as an ingredient rather than something on its own. You might like the caffeine in it. You might like that you don't get the effect of the caffeine or the stimulating effect, and it makes you sleepy. Sometimes I drink caffeine to go to sleep. Not too often. I'm made to understand there's some... Anyway, whatever, it's not a health video. I don't know if I recommend that. I'm not your doctor, but for me, my body's different than yours. Or maybe it isn't. The point is that the same coffee could fulfill most, if not all, of those things. It might not be able to fulfill literally all of them. It would be challenging to find a single coffee that would appeal to everyone. But I do think that you could get a coffee. I think I've had coffees before that, yeah, there's going to be the odd person who doesn't like them, but they are coffees that are trying to highlight multiple different like flavor categories of coffee. And for the person that is trying to enjoy what's there, this is a coffee. I have a coffee in mind I've had that I loved, and I think this coffee would appeal to almost everyone who wants almost anything out of coffee. Do you want it black? Do you want it as an ingredient? Do you want caffeine out of it? Do you want the acidity of coffee, the brightness, the fruit of coffee? Do you want the roastiness? Do you want some ash? This coffee had it all. And again, I'm sure there would be people that wouldn't like it. But my point is that there are like better designs. There are games that are literally just better designed to make more people happy at once. That is possible. Things are not a zero-sum equation. There's a lot of really interesting sociology that I think is really relevant to this parlay, unfortunately, about how a lot of modern societal problems stem from or have their roots in the idea that people still have this sort of like, there's a limited amount of resources and I need to get mine. And other people are going to like take a thing and then I won't be able to get it. And that isn't really true anymore. Like, there are places in our society where it's true. It does kind of depend on your situation. But in many places, that mindset is misapplied. It's only giving you trouble. That's not actually really true. And people just kind of have the habit of doing that. There are possible ways to engineer things, design things intelligently to just be better. You can't do that if you just make something that is the thing you want to make. And I'm not going to begrudge a game developer or anyone for making the thing they want to make, but it is possible to modify a thing, to deliberately construct a thing so that it is literally just a better compromise. And a compromise doesn't have to make everyone unhappy. There can be these really good solutions. To be absolutely blunt with you, I think that when people who actually make things say stuff like this, I kind of feel like it's a bit of a cop-out, subconsciously probably. It feels good if it's just true that there is no, truly better, elevated version of the thing that makes more people happy. That would be convenient because then you would be absolved of the responsibility of going for it. But that is not actually true. There are lots of examples of things that are a better compromise. It is not meaningless to try to say that some things are overall better than other things. Having said all of that, just as with coffee, there will be examples where even though I think that coffee I had in mind was overall the most masterful coffee I have ever drank. I think that if you had to pick one coffee to give to every single person in the entire world, and you evened out people's preference for the various different things coffee could do, like a lot of people prefer one thing right now, but if you let everyone try everything and then waited like 50 years, and then that evened out and people liked what they liked, and then you gave everyone this one coffee would make the most people happy, but it wouldn't make everyone happy. And that doesn't mean that there's no point in having other things. There are coffees I've had. This coffee I'm thinking of was a fairly dark roast, but the roaster very masterfully kept a lot of the fruit, a lot of the brightness, a lot of the acidity. It had like that tropical dark chocolate thing. Anyway, and I've had a very light roasted coffee before that was so different, so weird. Like I didn't like it, but it was fascinating, like really, really interesting. I'm very happy I drank that coffee. I didn't think it was good. I mean, it probably was technically good in some objectifiable way. That doesn't matter. But the point is, like, I didn't like it as much, maybe, but it was so different that there's no point in saying that it, like, doesn't deserve to exist, you know? So just to be clear, I'm not trying to say that everything being balanced or homogenized, you might negatively say it that way. I don't think that's unfair. I'm not saying that that is the ideal state, simply that balancing more or having things be like the default being balance, that is good. I don't feel it's really assailable that that is good. There isn't any drawback, except there is one. It's not a drawback, but you'll perceive it as, hold on, I can think of one group of people that actually does want things to be unbalanced. I can think of one group of people who doesn't want one coffee to be for everyone. For example, this is cooling very well. That was delicious. The first few zips were really harsh. They had like kind of a bad funk, a little funkiness. There is some natural processed coffee in here, so that will be in there, and I often like that. But it was a little funky. It had kind of like a fermented fruit in kind of an unpleasant way. Now that it's cooling, oh, wow, that's really good. Yeah, it has this chocolate thing. But anyway, the more I get into tasting notes, the more you think, wow, rather than being an every person who's trying to talk about what everybody might like, or at least trying to consider what people other than himself would like, it's beginning to sound like you want to get involved in your thing, not other people's things. Yes, it is possible that people would claim that they like a game to be unbalanced, and the reason, whether they would admit it or not, is because they like feeling better than other people. I hope it goes without saying that for the purposes of this parlay, that desire is invalid. Like, those people are just immature. They will grow up and stop wanting that, or die a child. I don't know how more bluntly I can put it, but this is kind of related to another topic, which is that there may be some people who currently like a game where things are unbalanced. And when I've said all this stuff, those people probably already left, unfortunately, but I didn't structure this parlay perfectly. Those people may be feeling like, you know, when you say that the game has to be balanced to be more fun, I'm having a lot of fun with a game that is unbalanced. And it kind of feels to those people like I'm not acknowledging their experience. And I am. I believe that they are having fun with that thing. Their fun doesn't like not counter something. But that's sort of a correlation, not causation. You can have fun with kind of anything, and if you are playing a game that is poorly balanced, well, some parts of it probably aren't poorly balanced, and they might also be better balanced for what you currently want. Yeah, perfectly valid. It's the game that isn't valid for being balanced that way, being like better than if it was balanced some other way. That it's not, but you're fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with you liking that thing. Again, unless you use it as a way to treat other people like subhuman filth. But that's kind of another story, isn't it? There are plenty of people who simply find the experience of having great power over their enemies novel. But that's the key. I don't mean any offense to you when I say this, but I promise that will wear off. That appeal of that will wear off. Humans will just get bored of a game where they effortlessly delete everything in sight. That will get boring. If it hasn't happened to you yet, you might be thinking, No, it won't. That is what I like. You're not acknowledging what I like. And I just want to be clear, I'm not omniscient, so it's possible that I don't know that. I'm just telling you from my experience with this. This is my job. I'm not old, but this is my job. I've had limited time to have experience, but this is what I do for work. I am confident in suggesting to you that that will grow old. That is an expiable appeal. Expiable? I don't think that's a word, but it is now. All words are made up. I do think there are things that appeal to people that are less consumable. I don't know if there's any sort of eternal appeals. This is an ontological or kind of like nature of existence and fulfillment based topic that I'm deeply interested in. And I do think it's a little related. I do also just want to talk about it, but I do think it's a little related to this parlay. I do think it's worth considering when you get into a game that's going to have hundreds or thousands of hours of your life in it. It's very worth considering whether the things that appeal to you about that game will get old. Or a similar piece of advice, when you think about making a YouTube channel, you need to think about whether you want to be making a YouTube channel, not just whether you want to have a YouTube channel. Do you want to tell people that you have a YouTube channel, or do you want to do the mechanical stuff that the job would entail? And the reason that I know that this is such a good fit for me as a creator is because I've thought about that. I know that, Parley, for example, I like the process of making this. It never ends. I'll never have done it, per se. It does feel good to finish a bunch of parlay, but what I like about it is that it gives me these experiences. I've described Parley, the Pantaloon Saloon channel, before as making myself do infinite mental jumping jacks to become the god of Q&A, because I want that. I want the experience of doing that. I find that fun. When I occasionally don't successfully upload a parlay, I don't manage them well, and sometimes I delete one. This one, I delete it, and this is me re-recording it. I like it. I have fun. I'm not upset. I'm not dreading. I woke up this morning and started recording it, but I'm having fun because I like this. I like this process. And I do think that's worth thinking about. I do think that a lot of people in a lot of games, the vocal minority, are the people who got into the game and the appeal of the game that they were excited about expired, and they view that as a problem with the game rather than a fact of human experience. To be blunt with you, I think that it's your responsibility to investigate that. It certainly doesn't make the game better if the game attempts to bend over backwards to fulfill that quality, but that is the game developer's responsibility. And here's where we should start talking about player perception, player opinion, player input. I really liked that sip of this coffee. The second point that you made, Yatogami, about how, the players are a big source of data about the game. In particular, the idea of using it as data is really good. Warframe is a really good example. So Digital Extremes is unique in some ways because they do three things a lot more than a lot of other developers do. The first one is directly speak to their community. They do more developer blogs, and they say more about what they're doing to the game. I don't think they always do a very good job explaining why, or like really what they're doing with their game. In fact, I think Digital Extreme's almost worst quality is explaining why they've done what they did to their game. I think it's often because they don't have a good reason. They're just listening to the community, often misguidedly, or because they explain it poorly. And that's unfortunate because I think the decisions are actually not bad a lot of the time, but their explanation and implementation is. But they talk to the community a lot more. Perhaps because of this, two other things happen. First of all, the vocal minority in Warframe gets more attention than in other games. This is good and bad. Remember that the vocal minority isn't automatically wrong, but the kinds of people who would be incentivized to go speak about a game angrily, wanting something changed on an online forum, well, wouldn't those be the people who wanted something about the game that was knowable from the start to be something that would expire? An appeal that had an expiration date, and they didn't really interrogate that enough. The game can never really fulfill that. So if they complain about it and the developers listen, that will never work. We don't even need to know what the specific thing is. That just like that kind of appeal is not fulfillable. It's just inherently impossible to fulfill. just like my endless thirst for delicious coffee. And in this case, water. And 3, Digital Extremes also gathers a lot of data. Now, of course, this part, I don't know for sure they do it more than other developers. That's probably the thing that they do most similarly to other people. But I do feel like that means something different when they also have a lot more of other types of community sentiment. Oh, another thing that Digital Extremes does more than a lot of other developers is partner with individual creators. There are a lot more of us, and speaking from personal experience, they've talked to us individually, and not a lot necessarily, but more than a lot of other developers who partner with players. I feel like this means that Digital Extremes gets more feedback overall by a pretty significant margin than most other developers. And this means that how they interpret that feedback matters a lot more. There's much more room for error. Focusing on the right feedback or mitigating the influence of that feedback matters much more because there is more of it. Changing that only a little would make a bigger change. And I think you can see that in Warframe. I think that they do a pretty bad job with this, to be blunt. I don't think this makes them stupid. It's hard. It's difficult. Asking for feedback, getting genuine feedback from people is hard. That's challenging. And to be blunt, I think that it's just too much. Like there's just too much of it for it to be useful. I think that you could make a good game, I don't know about Warframe, but a good game, if you listen to all of only my advice about Warframe. Now, that's cheating because I wouldn't listen to only my own advice. I would listen to all of you. But that's still limited sample size. But like, how would they ever choose who to listen to specifically? What are they going to test all the things I have to say and then all the stuff that everyone else has to say? I have a problem, viewer, listener. Sometimes I get people who message me stuff, or I've had a few people get mad at me over the years because they feel like I don't pay enough attention to individual ideas. I say I'm really excited about builds, but then they send me a bunch of stuff and I don't give some like really in-depth reply or whatever. And I can never really easily explain this to them, although I have tried. But it's ignorant of the idea that like, if it was only you doing that, then maybe it would be trivial to respond, but it isn't. Like, if it was only you messaging me in game in Warframe or wherever, it would be easy to respond, but it isn't. And it's the same thing with Digital Extremes. If we had any way to check if your specific recommendations were good, I bet you put a lot of thought into them, but to be blunt, they don't have time to do that. I mean, I don't think those recommendations are good most of the time, but it doesn't really even matter. Like, I think my recommendations are good, and that is completely irrelevant. Like, they should not listen to them. There is no logic by which they could determine whether they should listen to them. It's just not possible. I don't know. They would have to figure that out for themselves. So really, the better feedback would be, you know, here's a place where I don't really think anyone is happy. You know, like their wording. That's something that is, I don't think anybody would argue that that's good. The wording of individual mods is objectively inconsistent. The wording of patch notes consistently confuses everybody who reads them. Like, those things are bad. That is a good piece of feedback. They can do something about that. It doesn't take long. The person who does that can just hear that, and those probably people who do that can, you know, take that to heart, and that's at least something. It's not good feedback to say, let's make a whole game that addresses this unfulfillable desire that I have. And I do think that a lot of a vocal minority will be made up of people who think that. There will also be people who talk about a game because people are talking about it in a way that doesn't jive with their experience. In other words, people who like the game will talk about the game because they like the game and they don't feel other people talking about it really like it. That's true of me, for example. Although I don't give much direct feedback when I stream, sometimes I say, you know, I know developers listen to this, so here's the thing I have to say quickly, like I just did. But, you know, I'm talking about like people go on Reddit and stuff and talk with people who, by the way, you can't possibly benefit from these discussions because the people are not thinking about the same thing you are. They're not playing the same game. Like, don't do this. There's no point. I'm not trying to suggest that discussion isn't good, but this isn't discussion. Discussion requires opting in to being open-minded about the thing. And people who wanted something the game can never provide and then are insisting that the game provide it for them, that is the opposite of opting in to being open-minded. So don't do this. Like, save your breath, Calories. Save your calories. Because there's no point. Right. We can finally get to that little point I made a long time ago about how I don't think that the mass builder developers do mean that balance is pointless. Throughout this whole parlay, I've built up to this idea that when you develop a game, having everything be balanced is better for everyone. There are a variety of reasons players might enjoy a game with lots of different options, and it is possible to fulfill all of them at once, or nearly all of them at once, more of them than any other way, if the game is balanced. You may need to put some tools in the game. If there are a lot of options, the game is balanced. The player that doesn't want any options, you might need to do something to make it a little bit easier for them to choose, sure. But it's very doable. Like, you can do that. That's fine. Lots of games have done this. You could give many examples, some good, some bad, but they all make an attempt. Things like Automod and Warframe, which you could easily make much better, by the way. And Magic the Gathering does a lot of this. There's just a lot of formats to play the game. The game is designed to be played at a lot of power levels, which inherently, that's one of Magic's strengths, which allows many different types of players who want many different things to just go buy a deck of various power levels, play with various groups of people that I think are reasonably well telegraphed. It's a huge problem in Magic, but the game does better than many other games do at telegraphing, like, what level of competitiveness will this be, for example. There are lots of other examples. A game like Hades, for example. You can literally remove choice from Hades. Just make it so you can't pick boons if you want. That's a bit of a silly example, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like, it's pretty easy to do stuff like that if you want to. There's lots of development options for that. It is better if a game is balanced, because everything will feel overpowered, because everything is the same level of power. And if you're thinking, but that means nothing would feel overpowered, well, you can have lower rank weapons that you get earlier on, and that can provide the feeling that this weapon is more powerful than others. You do not need the feeling that this weapon that is supposed to be, like, as difficult or as good to use as this other weapon. You don't have to have weapons at the end of the game that are weaker to make other weapons seem stronger. That is not required. You could argue that it is, but I'm arguing it isn't. You can do that by having weapons earlier in the game be less powerful. You do not need to make weapons that are intended to be powerful less powerful as a sacrifice to the people who want a power fantasy weapon. That is simply not necessary. I think that's demonstrably not necessary. I only wish I could demonstrate it to you. But you'll have to decide for yourself. I think that's true. I think you can just look at games that people seem satisfied by, and, like, it just is true. There's so many examples. I can't find any count. Well, anyway, because I don't like those games. Go figure. I don't know, but that's what I think. But here's the kicker. That's if the game is balanced. No games are perfectly balanced, which means the game is unbalanced, and making the game more balanced does cause problems. What do you do? That example I gave before about how if you have a game that, something was stronger than something else, and then you balance it down, even if you do that correctly, and again, a lot of people hear balancing and they think bad balancing. That thing is balanced down but too far. It's often over-nerfed. That's just bad balancing. That's not a knock against balance. That's a knock against the developers, I guess. But it's hard. You could say it's a knock against balancing because that's hard. Anyway. The point is, we're talking about the fact that that item that was more powerful and is now brought down, that will feel different than if they had always been the same power level. Players will remember when they did thousands of damage and then now they're doing hundreds. But if you cut all player damage by 10 times and cut the enemy health by the same amount, that's literally the same. Like, the actual number doesn't matter, except if it was different before. Then suddenly it does, because you have that association. Before we go any further, I would like to quickly say that I actually don't think that this is a reason not to balance things. I feel that's mortgaging the game being objectively better for the players that already play it. And not even all types of players actually care about this type of change. It is only a subset of players. and only those subset of players that are already playing the game that actually care about this type of thing. So personally, I think that, not to throw those people under the bus, but it isn't enough of a cost to hold the game's overall excellence hostage just because there is that subset of a subset of people that will not like it. But that's still thousands, hundreds of thousands of people for most games. So I'm not trying to say I don't understand why developers are hesitant to do that, but that doesn't make it, it's certainly not utilitarian. Let's say it that way. All of that being said, I do also think that, again, those players that found that to be a fulfilling power fantasy, that would have expired anyway. So they'll never thank you for it. But at the end of the day, they're not actually losing much, even if they do not think that themselves. You could reword it a different way. It's not really possible to make those people permanently happy. That feeling will wear off, and then you would just have this problem anyway. Doing nothing, because you're worried those players will be upset, will eventually result in them being upset anyway about something else, about the fact that the power fantasy wore off and the game isn't doing enough. That will happen. That does happen in these games, in my many years of experience, even as an only relatively young person. So I do think it's pointless not to balance things, like, just because this is true. But we're not talking about that. What if you want to be a real guy and make the game, seem like it's balanced really well? If only those few players who feel like, oh, but I remember the number being bigger, blah. If only those players just didn't feel that way. If only it appeared that your intention was indeed to make the game more fun. If only you could just tell the players that you intended the game to be more fun. What if, hypothetical scenario number one, the mass builder developers, or any developer, I think people do this all the time, it might sound conspiratorial, but I think it's commonly done, said that they didn't care about balance, but then just made balance changes anyway. Do you know how few people read the patch notes for these games? You see where I'm going with this? People do this. Like, I'm sure a few of you are thinking, okay, yeah, he's crazy. It was the coffee. You're not a coffee black hole. You're some kind of spectrometer or something. The depth of the coffee has addled your brain. And maybe it has. It smells so good. I don't know what it is about this coffee. It smells like, okay, so if you had like a nougat chocolate bar and you just melted it on like your dashboard or something, made a huge mess, but it would smell so good. Like that type of malted chocolate. Oh, it smells so good. It's so weird. Why? Oh, it's so good. It was so bad when it was hot. Now it's like room temperature. A lot of coffees cool really well like that. Oh, it's so good. Anyway. Oh, wow. That hits. That's so good. Just got to leave the coffee for 52 minutes while you record Parley, and then it'll be delicious. Why didn't I think of that? Anyway, yeah, the thing about deceiving the players this way is that, again, like, a lot of them just don't actually have any basis for being upset about it. They don't check the patch notes. They wouldn't actually notice if there was a system like this in place. In fact, I would argue that what really matters to many of these people is just that other people are telling them that this is true of the game, and the developers are not saying something else. Again, it is silly that the player doesn't just assume the developers have the goal of making the game fun, because of course they do. I talked about that at the beginning of the video. But that's just another way to say that all you have to do is tell the player your goal is to help them have fun, and a lot of people will be reassured. As silly as this seems, it's very much like a placebo. Like, there's a real effect here. You do actually make the game more balanced by saying that you care more about players having fun than balance, but then balancing the game. Like, that actually changes the balance of the game, because the balance of the game is the objective qualities of the items, the subjective experience people have, and the community's opinion, which influences many members of it in explicit and implicit ways. Even if the community doesn't all like read other community sentiments, they might simply see other players using those items. They might be in a group setting, in group content, where certain things are considered more desirable, whether or not they actually are, whether that's supported by other sentiments or that's just what the community thinks. They might be influenced by the developers being influenced by people that that individual player isn't directly listening to. There might be balance changes made. This happens all the time in games that aren't really, they're not targeted at that specific player. They're not really for that specific player. They're not addressing a problem that is a problem for that one player, but they have an effect that does affect that player with some kind of cascading effect. The balance of that thing is changed for a reason that wasn't for that player, but does affect them. And so these things are not in a vacuum. You know, it's true that this entire environment is partially built on what the players think about it. So telling the players that the game is a way isn't dissimilar to actually making the game be that way. And it's very possible that, like many other developers, these developers know that, and that's why they said this. Here's the other possibility. They may simply not mean this at all. They have no intention of making balance changes, but the game isn't actually unbalanced to begin with. How about that? So what I'm referring to is the idea that they're acknowledging that players are complaining about things being unbalanced, but they actually aren't unbalanced. Like, they have immense data and other player sentiment to support the idea that, like, only a very small number of people think this thing is unbalanced. And you may be able to pair that apart. Those few people might be right. The common consensus isn't automatically of value. Those few people might be right, but they're probably wrong. And they're probably just piggybacking on each other's opinions. They probably have a very biased perspective or a very limited perspective. Maybe they're trying to do something with the game that the game isn't really trying to do. And so from their perspective, that is unbalanced. And the developers may be trying to reassure those people in a way that doesn't require the developers to actually follow up on that idea. They're just trying to give players the sentiment that, hey, look over here, we're saying our bit. It just isn't really unbalanced. But they're not going to say it that way because the players would say, but it is, and it just gets into a shouting match. So instead, they've worded it as, you know, we'll just let those things continue to be that way when people like that power fantasy. This also addresses people complaining about something being too strong for people who feel like that's a problem by clarifying that the developers they're pointing out that there are players that like that, you know, by clarifying that's fulfilling somebody else's desires. Even if the developers actually know that the things aren't even unbalanced to begin with, and that they don't need to have something be overpowered to fulfill that player's desires. They might just say this as a complicated way to deal with the community. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, that's just a little bit too much chess for me. You're doing a leveling thing where they think this, but you know they're thinking this, but you know that they know that you're thinking this, or they think they know that you're thinking that, and then you do that. People do this, but you might think it's far-fetched for them to be doing it in this situation. I gotta tell you, as somebody who moderates a community myself, that even I, an unpaid for that part of my job professional, I think some of you give me money because you value that I do that. That's unfair, I'm sorry. It does require a lot of thought. It's something where you'll learn quickly, if you do that for a living, that you're going to hesitate every time you want to perform an action. You're going to think, but it has to feel right to the players as well. It's not about deception. It's about how even if you do a thing, it doesn't feel true to people. You also need to provide a story that feels comprehensible. It might not actually feel chaotic, but just depending on the amount of updates you give the player, things will feel different. It will feel more or less organized. It will feel more or less reliable just by how often you tell the players what you're doing as the developer or the creator or whoever. And I don't think that that is some kind of underhanded manipulation. I think that is wise. That is understanding what it is to have a parasocial relationship with someone, a relationship where you're not there in person, you kind of control the flow of output for how much you experience each other in a limited way. So I hope that makes sense. I don't have a whole lot else to say. I really enjoyed this subject. I hope you enjoyed having a bevy with me. Making the whole room smell real good. I wish you could be here. I really don't wish that. Sorry. This is my space. Thank you, no thank you. But I wish I could send the smell through the computer. I don't know. Just stick your nose near the the speakers. It'll work.